So I wanted to kind of talk about what you've got going on in that article that you wrote on your newsletter there. I thought that
Yeah,
was pretty
yeah,
good.
that one, the COVID one.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
you're officially a COVID denier now, right?
No, no, I'm a COVID believer. I
Yeah.
believe in the I've always the first point at which I heard the lab leak theory was actually in early January 2020. And the way in which I heard it was that I heard from someone that Wendy Deng, who used to be married to Rupert Murdoch, was saying that it leaked from a lab. So, Wendy Deng, if you look at her history, she's quite a character, but she's certainly not unconnected. And so, in a way, the first way that I heard this was basically as an indirect rumor, coming from people who would be expected to know this. And then it's sort of obviously it's just there's sort of too much circumstantial evidence from a Bayesian perspective to really make it even like it should be the null hypothesis essentially.
Right. Well, it seems I've been kind of following the story for some time, consistently covering whatever I could find on it on the radio, and Steve Hilton did a good story investigating this way back on Fox News. And then you had, of course, the science writer Nicholas Wade did that good Substack piece that really laid it out pretty strongly, the circumstantial evidence
Yeah.
for the lab. But, now, of course, it's become mainstream. But the question is, how can people take anything that the social media sites and news media say seriously about almost anything
Well,
when they so deliberately, put their thumb on the scale of this being a considered option.
well, it's I mean, it's just an illustration of a sort of a broader phenomenon. It's a very visible illustration, and I think that a while ago on my blog, I was or newsletter is or whatever we're calling them these days. I was saying, drawing the obvious comparison between COVID and Chernobyl. And what you saw when you looked at Chernobyl is that you're like, imagine you're a Soviet citizen and you're looking at Chernobyl, and how are you? I mean, this is the conventional wisdom. How are you supposed to think about it? Are you supposed to think that the director of the plant is responsible? Are you supposed to think that the chief scientist at the plant is responsible? Are you supposed to think that the regional power administration is responsible? Are you supposed to, and that goes on. Are you supposed to think that the general secretary is responsible? Are you supposed to think that the whole Soviet system is, in a sense, responsible? Can I sort of trace a line between this unbelievable comedy of disaster and the way things actually work in our country? And and sort of show that in a way this is not an exception, this is really a generalized problem. And so the question that you're asking is there any authority that's out there that's worth trusting? And the problem really is that of course there isn't, and there hasn't been for quite some time. And the what's more interesting, that's sort of not so unusual in a way. What is a more interesting question is why that niche is not properly filled. And so when you look at these authorities that are sort of have this prestige of purveying truth that we now, through this very, very, visible example, which will become only more visible as it kind of cements and becomes what everyone believes, which I hope will happen in some way. By this very visible example, you see that, as I phrased it in that post, maybe putting virologists in charge of virology was not such a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
And our the whole way in which our system of governance works, even down to such a thing as virology, and clearly virology is relevant to governments. But even down to such a thing as virology, you have a whole system of government that sort of reinforces expertise with power, that says, let's put the virologists in charge of virology. And it so happens that when you put the virologists in charge of virology, they actually have a number of conflicts of interest. And those conflicts of interest, sort of cause them institutionally to have strange incentives that, even if they were just like thought viruses were totally cool, or like really cared about protecting humanity against viruses and had like big private fortunes and just could do whatever they want, would they be doing some of this shit? No, I don't think they would. I think that a lot of these experiments were driven by the bureaucratic incentives that virologists have when you put them in charge of virology. So, for example, when you look at these Chinese, all of these gain of function experiments, there's a Twitter thread by the notorious Dr. Peter Daszak where he's like, which he's left up, where he's like just so excited that he's found he and his collaborators in Wuhan have found bat coronaviruses that could infect human cells. And the reason he's excited about this is basically, why is this research being done? This research is being done for the same, direct concrete motives that all researchers have, which is you want more high impact publications. So you have essentially this thing that's sort of partly the pursuit of nature that has this justification that's total baloney, that like basically like going out and playing with fire will help us like protect the house against fire or something, like, and like there's no one can articulate at all a benefit of this research. Like, it's really speculative and hand wavy, if there is anything at all. So why are they doing it? They're doing it to get high impact papers. And the thing is, that's a disease that has affected American science considerably. That disease is much more rampant in Chinese science, which publishes, obviously there's no like special Chinese science that publishes in the same journals that we do. And in China, to advance in your career, you have very basic metric based, like really stuff that in the US would strike us as crass. You want to be the head of a major university hospital surgery department, you need 4 high impact publications or something like that. It's like the straight up quota system. And so, what they've basically developed in Wuhan was like, here is a series of papers that we can write about things that seem important. Why do they seem important? They seem important because they're scary and dangerous to the whole human race. Therefore, the human race should protect itself from these threats, which we've gone out and painstakingly found and cultivated, by funding us more. And therefore, our work is important and justifies these high-impact publications. So you have this whole system that is being directed. It's not being directed for like the prestige of the Soviet Union or something. It's being directed in this whole other way, which is completely irrational when looked at, as a whole from a top-down sense. But basically, sort of, moves everyone's perception within virology of, oh, this is how I and my peers get funded. Because within virology, of course, if you're a virologist and you're calling for a shutdown of gain of function research, which, a number of virologists, real Harvard PhD virologists, genuine experts, were brave enough to do, which shows you, that this field still works to a considerable extent. But it's also, they couldn't actually do it. And what actually happened is, specifically with this research, I'm a little fuzzy on the details, but what seems to have actually happened is that they basically, this effort got like some like board that had to approve gain of function research. And then it was just a simple matter to say, well, this is not a gain of function research thing, so it doesn't have to go before the board, or the board can be stacked with the right kind of people, or it's just child's play to get past these pieces of paper, right? And so, the thing is, if you're a virologist and you're like, this kind of research should be shut down, you're an asshole. Because basically, all your friends, this is what everyone is doing. There's a global consensus that it matters. Everyone's like, well, to protect ourselves against the threat of these emerging viruses, we must study them and play with them and put them up our noses. And it's ludicrous, but it's a sort of shared reality distortion field, of this entire field of human inquiry. So, and there's just absolutely no one who can say, wait a minute, this is fucked. And actually, we're going to, no one within, even within the deep state, even within the civil service, like no one, okay, could Dr. Fauci have done it? Probably he could have done it. But if he was the guy to do it, he wouldn't be where he was. So you have these little imperial bureaucrats, but these imperial bureaucrats who are, in some cases have a kind of monarchical authority, but these imperial bureaucrats are kind of like Putin. They're sort of tied to this like web of mafia, and all of their power comes from these sort of mysterious cliques that they're tied into. And so, they can't basically tell their friends to go fuck themselves because their friends are where their power comes from, even if they could get away with it, but they'd probably be like burning their whole career or something. So, you have, this is the mind, this is the sort of the brain that drove this research. And then I think most Americans would just be like, why is the US funding a lab in China? And they would have no idea that that's a perfectly normal, regular thing to do. Right. And so you have this whole sort of strange system that nobody designed, that sort of doesn't seem to be working for any rational purpose, that if you dig into it with like an ounce of common sense, you're like, well, even if it was, a bat bit a donkey which bit a goose, this easily could have caused this problem. And so, like, you certainly are well beyond denying the plausibility of a lab leak at this point, which means that this is a threat that was being completely ignored, whether or not, the bat bit the donkey bit the goose, right? So you have this situation where you have this machine which seems to be on autopilot, which is clearly, can survive this sort of brutal physical assault of Trump just completely unscathed, with its operations just somewhat disrupted. And by the way, it was some the Trump administration actually sided with the gain of function people in some obscure bureaucratic spat. So it certainly helps to have the political side of the administration on your side, but, the CDC is untouchable. It's like a rock in a storm. And so you see that, this whole system, virology, is completely unaccountable except to the virologists. And you essentially can't imagine a sort of an organized way of holding it accountable. In fact, one of the best things that's come out of this is that you've seen, basically you have seen the creation of like sort of quality, not even necessarily decentralized, because any center of thinking is a center, but you've seen basically, a certain level of quality non-mainstream scholarship emerge just in the effort to sort of bring this down. The problem is that the institutional strength of this, sort of ad hoc machine for holding one tiny element of virology accountable sort of doesn't conceive itself as becoming an institution that would hold all of science accountable, and we can't even imagine what that institution would be shaped like. Right. So, you have this basically this very deep problem here. And, if I can, pick on many of the people that might be listening here, what instead, sort of conservative media has chosen to do is to focus on breadth rather than depth. And so, there's a lot of owning the libs. There's a lot of like, oh, we've proved them wrong, so that means we're going to win. Well, yes, assuming that there is a, beneficent and active God out there who basically will solve all your problems for you, you've proved them wrong, and so you're definitely going to win. And other than that, you've proved them wrong, and you think you're the first, and it's like that great still from the Coen Brothers movie, First Time, and so really the question of what would it mean to have an authority, both in the sense of a formal power and in the sense of actually an institution capable of doing the job, that could basically think about this and be like, no, actually, virologists, like, you should be studying this and not that, because this is basically, the flaming self-licking ice cream cone, and that is something that is actually super relevant and important, right? And so, I mean, there was certainly plenty in retrospect. If you'd looked at this pandemic and you'd said, okay, I have a time machine. I'm going to go back 10 years and tell virologists to prepare for this effectively. Some of the work that was done, sort of post SARS, that actually really did help with SARS too. Like the stabilized spike protein thing is really a thing, right? So, but then there was all this stuff that was motivated by this kind of close call pandemic of SARS, which of course was like 10 to 20 times more deadly at least than COVID. That just turned into what actually created COVID, as far as I think the the null hypothesis should be at this point. And so to have that level of sort of direction over science is something where, first of all, who would be doing that thinking? Who actually has the credibility to think in that way? And then how would you combine that with the authority to effectively think in that way? That's the systemic problem that this event raises for people. And I don't see people, sort of even, they're like, well, maybe people should wear, 3 more masks when they're working with, Chinese lab cultures involving live bats.
Apparently the level of security that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was using to do this type of research was on the level of a dentist office.
That's right. BSL 2. I think that's an accurate characterization. And I'm going to butcher the Chinese here, but the fact is that there's a well-known phenomenon in China. Is not Japan. It's not even Korea. There's a well-known phenomenon in China, and I'm going to butcher the Chinese here, xiaobuduo, which means basically good enough, close enough for government work, is like a real thing in like a lot of Chinese enterprise, right? And if you're a major Western firm working with that, you just have to make it very, very clear what good enough is. But in this case, basically good enough was wearing gloves in the lab. And not mouth pipetting, bat spit, but yeah, I mean, this is what this, like Chernobyl, in which they're like, oh, we're going to test the emergency systems by causing a reactor accident and turning all the emergency systems off. This was a very predictable disaster in many ways. And yet, the chance that it would have been predicted or headed off was, I think, very low in retrospect.
Isn't the only one of the few mechanisms one could imagine to rein in this kind of field that, like you're talking about, would be skin in the game, that there should be repercussions if it can be, demonstrated with a more credible evidence that folks like, Dr. Fauci continued to fund this type of lab with dentist-level security standards, even after State Department cables were indicating, hey, this is not quality, this is not a safe enough lab to do this stuff.
I think that's like punishing the, the regional nuclear facility administrator or the regional head of electricity for Chernobyl. I think that, sure, the problem with basically governance through sort of random punishment like this is it's like saying, well, should Alger Hiss have been punished? Well, he should have been punished, and of course he was punished. Did that have anything to do really with the sort of computing an accurate historical reckoning and unraveling the legacy of the U.S.-USSR relationship between 1933 and 1945? No, it did not.
Right.
Or 1923 and 1945. I mean, and so, can you say, of course, in this populist sense that, this should, Dr. Fauci's career should suffer for this? Maybe you can. I don't think it really gains anything in particular. People are thrown under the bus in the system all the time. And, what I think conservatives often miss is they get someone thrown under the bus, and they're like, well, this will send them a message. And, the message that it sends is that, the pole of success is greasy and people will always fall off for random reasons. And anybody will be thrown under the bus if he's basically less, more useful to the party under the bus, right? And, there are always plenty of people to replace these people. And so you're not like, if you're up against, an oligarchy, a strategy of attrition is really not your best move. And so you could. I mean, it's
well, yeah, I wasn't suggesting just Dr. Fauci. I'm saying I'm looking at it more of the critique of what happens when government has these monopoly funding mechanisms that dominate an entire field of knowledge, like what you're saying, not virology, where there's no feedback mechanism, there's no brakes for what they can do because the entire faceless bureaucracy can make a mistake and kill 3 million plus people, and they get more funding, and they just keep going. And it's like, how in the hell is that sustainable?
There's no, if you look at the structure of, sort of funding and power kind of follow each other. And as not only is virology funded by these the government, what's more important is that it's trusted by the government. And so essentially you have, if you imagine a weird world in which virology was not trusted by the government. And so you had basically a totally separate, let's say that, we're like, okay, oversight over virology is going to go to the Catholic Church, right? So this is a completely different set of people than the scientists. And the scientists will be like, oh yeah, we want to put this thing in mutant rats with human lungs to see if it kills the rats. And the bishops would be like, what? And in this case, it's not too difficult to predict the bishop's response. And in this case, I think the bishops would have been right. In other cases, they might be wrong. But the point is that there you have a separate authority. And one thing, if we want to get all American today, one thing that you'll note that was a very strong belief of the founders and very true is that only power can be set against power, right? And so your problem is that you have, the incentives acting on this field have essentially kind of turned them into mad scientists, and they have an incentive to basically, play, play mad scientist. And you have all these kind of, the best virologists in the world are kind of all sort of turning into young Frankenstein, and just because of they have a bureaucratic incentive to do so. And that bureaucratic incentive is felt especially keenly in China, which happens to be a very bureaucratic place in certain strange ways. And there's no power that can be set against them. Sure, you can say, oh, let's let's prosecute someone for this, let's scapegoat, someone for that. That's, from the perspective of power, that's just taken as kind of an occupational natural hazard, like crashing your car in Formula One. You're not really having an effect on the system. You're not really teaching people a lesson when you basically scapegoat them like this. You're teaching them to be more risk averse. They are already extremely risk averse. And you're sort of setting up this new category of risks, which is not going to cover the next thing they fuck up like this.
What about cutting funding? You don't think that's effective either? Or
well,
dramatically?
I mean, yeah, it's. I mean, this sort of gets into the question of, what I do with all these people. If I was in charge, I would actually, God forbid. Obviously, I'm a philosopher, not a Caesar, but I do feel that we could maybe just possibly use a Caesar. And so, the question of what would Caesar do with these people is, I think, quite relevant. And, one of the things that is notable about Caesar in specific is that despite his treatment of the Gauls, when it came to Romans, he was an extremely merciful man. He was, if anything, largely too merciful. And there's nothing he liked more than to basically take the personnel of the enemy and having totally institutionally dissolved and destroyed that enemy, regard those personnel as his own. And so this was a very, very sharp contrast from the general Roman pattern of these kinds of events, with this sort of failed, Caesars like Marius and Sylla, where they'd basically just kill all the people, who were big shots in the old regime and take their stuff. And which seemed very logical. And Caesar was like, no, actually, we won, so there are people. So if you think about basically all of these virologists, first of all, you have to look at the field and make a determination. Is this still a real field of science? Are these people doing science? Are they actually in touch with the physical structure of reality? In this case, I think they are. So that's a lesser level of corruption than you'll find in other fields.
Like
right?
some
In other
parts of
fields,
physics and stuff, yeah.
Yeah, or even I mean, there's a whole ladder that descends downward from STEM, right? And clearly at a certain level, you're just looking at the equivalent of Marx-Lenin studies, kind of post 1989. There's no reason why Marx-Lenin studies should be taught in German universities in 1990, right? But is there a reason why virology should be taught in American universities, supposing that there is such a thing? Yes, definitely. So, these people are in general valuable researchers, right? And the thing is that their incentives have directed them into this extremely toxic and dangerous, game of stamp collecting. And the first thing that needs to be done is basically to stop that game. So what I would actually do with all of these scientists is I would actually reward them. What I would do is I would say, okay, your research is motivated by accountability. It's actually motivated by saying you as a scientist are going to pursue this thing that is useful to the public. You're not going to just go and follow your whims like some 19th century naturalist. The public needs to be defended against the threat of bat coronaviruses, and you must pursue this threat. That's what they said to you. That's what Power said to you. And you said to Power, yes, I will go out and find the bat coronaviruses and evolve them to infect humans and tinker with their DNA and write more papers. You were asked to do that, and you did it. So in a sense, the doing of this thing is not, you're like someone who was asked to commit a war crime and did it. The doctrine that this sort of does it make you culpable in a sense? I think it makes you not a saint. I think that definitely makes you like the people who actually were like, no, I'm going to risk my career and speak out about against this, are definitely better than you. Okay, but that's not to say that you were a bad person. You were just actually a normal person. You're doing normal science. And so what we're going to do is we're going to say, fine, this accountability thing hasn't worked out. Here's what we're going to do instead of accountability. We're going to take your whole grant stream. We're never going to ask you to write another goddamn grant again. We're going to take your whole grant stream. We're going to extend that out indefinitely as basically a perpetual, disbursement. We're going to securitize that into a bond that issues that revenue stream. We're going to give you that bond personally. So actually what we're going to do is we're going to sever all of your ties to and that includes overhead. That includes overhead. Scientists, if you're out there, you know what I mean. So that adds like 60%, right? So all of this revenue stream that's out there that has been flowing through the universities and through these systems now flows directly to the scientist and is in fact entirely in the scientist's personal possession. So, picture yourself, you're a professor of like stamp collecting bullshit. And you could have one of two attitudes about this. You could be like, well, I got a family. I grill on the weekends. This is a good gig. Am I passionate about what I do? Not really. I haven't really felt that way since I was about 23, but it's a thing. Suddenly you have this system. It presents you with this bond. What do? You sell it. You're like, okay, I got to diversify my portfolio. This is my money. I'm keeping it. I don't really care. I'm not going to pretend to care. Or you basically say, and in that case, science is well rid of you, and you should not be out there collecting flaming stamps. You should be basically out there feeling lucky for having won the lottery. And you basically got bought out of your power. And so once you basically buy all this deadwood out in a very spectacular way that rewards them considerably for being in the right place at the right time, perhaps their eligibility is diminished unless they write a full and frank confession. But this is very straightforward kind of Machiavellian politics. You want to basically actually own these people, and you certainly don't want them to be hostile to you. And so you're basically saying, if you are a real virologist, here's what you get to do. You get to study anything about virology that you want. You get to basically be the sort of guardian of this little endowed institution that's basically been created from your grant structure as a principal investigator, and basically shepherd it forward into the future. You get to train, your successor. You get to found your own school of virology. You can basically think whatever the fuck you want about virology and write whatever the fuck you want about virology indefinitely. You can basically be like a Victorian gentleman scientist with a big endowment and a restless curiosity, right? And so, if you're actually studying virology under those terms, the chance that you're going to go like full like mad scientist on us and be like, no, we must find all the bad viruses and study them. But first we must put on gloves, right? Is not what's going to happen here. Right. And so
what if you gave them that and then they still didn't wash their hands when they ate their ham sandwich and they unleashed
I think at that point you're dealing with the kind of people that would do that would just take the money. And so, what you're doing is you're basically saying, if I look at the professionals in this field, they're all still very talented. They actually know something about viruses. This is very good and very important. Their conscientiousness is all over the map. And because their conscientiousness is all over the map because it's had a conflict of interest with their professional standards. And this is actually what drove me to basically drop out of computer science, is that I could feel these tensions going in two different directions. And when your conscientiousness and your professional standards, and your sort of professional advancement are pulling in different directions, your conscientiousness is going to suffer. So, broadly speaking, what we observe in virology is that, and in much of science, is that it really needs to have more than anything, what needs to be restored is the independence and the conscientiousness of the scientists themselves. There was recently an exposure of a big collusion ring in computer science conference papers, where basically people steered articles to favorable reviewers and so forth, sort of precisely for this paper gaming reason, because the paper count is just so important, and it's all important, right? And there was an interesting post about this that got some popularity, and the post was like, please everyone cheat more openly. And it was like, it's good that this like just blatant crap has been exposed, because the low-key, subtle, cool, can always get away with it version is everywhere. And it's everything. And, and this is just like all the institutions of science. Science is sort of such a perfect example of the regime change we need in some ways, because the people in it are generally great. They're generally fine, but all of the institutions just need to just be utterly blown up into dust, and that dust needs to be like taped off and sealed away and like dumped deep in the ocean. And I think that I think there are very few scientists who would tell you that the institutions of science in general are working well. And so, in all over all of these fields, and of course it's not just a problem in science, but in all of these fields, what we're seeing is that you have this sort of enormous kind of corruption of, corruption is not too strong a word. It's not really quite monetary corruption per se, but corruption is essentially the manifestation of a conflict of interest. Mm-hmm. And when you have this situation where, the science is in charge of the science, it basically falls into these kind of attractor structures that are just pure conflict of interest. And once you have essentially bad science drives out good science, because once you have, bad science that sort of feels a little stinky in any way, whether it's, unoriginal, whether it's, once it starts to not smell so fresh, it has to defend itself. And because it has to defend itself, it has to kind of form these oligarchical structures of defense. And that's where we get this incredible, Dr. Daszak, who, as of all people, Nathan Robinson, the ultra-lib notes in his ultra-lib magazine, Current Affairs, is basically like, the prime suspect in the murder getting himself appointed as the chief detective, right? I mean, it's just like it literally, he's the person who like organized this research and managed this research, and then he organizes the response to say that he's not guilty, and then he organizes the investigation in China, right? And people find this credible, all because it has this sort of strange 1930s alphabet soup branding of the World Health Organization. Who created this organization? God only knows. Who is it made of? God only knows. How does it work? God only knows. But it has those 3 letters, and it's more than just prestigious. It's legitimate in some abstract sense, right? And it has this legitimacy. And where does this legitimacy come from? Were they elected? Were they like? It has this, legitimacy, which seems to sort of flow out of, pure air, and in fact flows basically out of the Roosevelt administration, and is like, totally, conscious, if conscientiousness among scientists is weak, conscientiousness among science bureaucrats, science journalists, and people like that is an order of magnitude weaker. And especially when you get into the world of the international Swiss third world bureaucracy, which is just rife with all kinds of nepotism and corruption. And I mean, like literally Ghebreyesus, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, before he became director general of the WHO, he's from obviously Ethiopia, which has been a public health power for quite some time, and his previous claim to fame was literally that he helped cover up a cholera epidemic, and so or was credibly accused of helping to cover up a cholera epidemic. Apparently, it was just some diarrhea, and nothing to worry about, citizens. And so you have this thing that is operating in these procedures that are completely irrational, that no one has any rational reason to trust, that no one even understands, that is basically taken seriously on the basis of nothing. And I think where I differ from most commentators on this is that I think most commentators, look at this and they're like, we must call attention to this. Okay, great. You've called attention to it. What is to be done? Well, it must be fixed. How is it to be fixed? Hand waving. This thing is wrong. That thing is wrong. And I'm just, I look at this thing and I'm like, no, it obviously needs to be replaced. And no one is particularly working on replacing it in a way that I would consider really adequate. Let's take just, for example, okay, you have this sort of ad hoc effort to, this drastic team, as it's called, a bunch of, scientists, mostly pseudonymous, who basically have kind of worked together to really pound this hypothesis over the last year. Okay, that's one thing. That's a group of people. That's better than individual people. How do you make that into an institution? How do you replicate that? How do you basically go around and say, okay, first and foremost, let's create something that is capable of taking these bureaucratic public science conclusions and really revisiting them in the spirit of, Victorian science, in which is basically a no holds barred spirit. Scientists still know how to do this. They just won't do it in public. You go to any journal club or anything, and you'll see people tear papers to shreds. But doing it in public is this act of aggression, and so and it really is an act of aggression, and you just can't do that. You can't make enemies in science. Nobody has room for that, and so you have this whole system that's become kind of dysfunctional because of its lack of competitive discourse. You need some way of resuscitating that in a way that's not just like Alex Jones fans arguing at each other in a subreddit. You need basically high quality adversarial discourse, which is kind of the original foundation of science. You need that to happen in a structured and an effective way that can sort of be broadened. And instead you just have people complaining, basically.
And that's the big story of this last year and this year is, and ongoing, is the fact that if you want to talk about science, you have to go through this big other called the science, right? And this the science versus science is the big story that we're all dealing with.
Right, and the problem is there's only the science. There's no science, right? And so the thing is, when people think about and partly this is due to an excess of sort of libertarian and even democratic ideology, is people think that the alternative to the science is basically, whatever you heard on Joe Rogan last week or something. And no, actually, if you want there to be science as opposed to the science, that doesn't just happen. Right? That's not just a thing of like, oh yeah, I really have this like expert with this cool website I like, and I buy his supplements and they totally, make my dick hard. Like, I mean, and that's sort of the quality of what's really sad